Jenkins office hour about workflow plugin compatibility. And I want to see if anyone else is able to see this. Not sure who else might be on. Probably a few people. If not, this ought to be recorded. There is a YouTube page for it, so it should be possible for people to see this in recording mode as well. I'm going to open up, try to open up a Q&A section. It doesn't look like that's going to work at the moment. So instead, I'm going to ask that if people have questions, they can try to ask them in IRC. And I'll try to respond in IRC instead. All right, well, I hope I still don't see any viewers. I don't know if that's supposed to be showing anything. So I'm just going to hope that it is live and that someone is watching. So in brief, Jenkins workflow is, as most of you probably know, is a new plugin system that generalizes how Jenkins plugins, or how Jenkins users can define jobs in Jenkins, so how they can run different build steps in various sequences. And rather than a traditional UI configuration, uses Groovy language scripts to define the build steps. And so what I'd like to talk about today is what you as a Jenkins plugin author can do in order to make sure that your plugin is available to be used from workflow. So essentially, there are a number of different APIs, both in Jenkins core and in workflow, which allow plugins to contribute functionality to workflow scripts. Okay, I do see that there is at least one viewer. Hi, James. All right. Encouraging. So I'm going to talk about today is what you can do from a plugin to make sure that your functionality is available from a workflow. So there are a few different ways to do this. And these things are listed in this page, which is available on GitHub, which talks about the plugins that are already compatible, the list of those. And then at the bottom, it gives a guide that lists the particular changes that you can make to your plugin in order to make it compatible. So I'm going to go through a sample plugin and show how some of these things actually work in practice. There's basically two things that you can do. One is that you can write your own workflow step. So this is a dedicated function that would appear in Groovy. I've written up I have a basic guide. I hope to add some more content here that describes what you need to do in order to implement a step from scratch. This gives you a lot of power because you can customize exactly how it works in workflow. But the downside is that you need to learn workflow-specific APIs. What I'll focus on, at least for the first part of the hour that we have, depending on whether people chime in with interests they have, is rather taking advantage of newer core APIs to make the same class work both in a traditional freestyle project and from a workflow script, mostly transparently. So you only have one class that you're offering in your plugin, but both kinds of projects can access it. So basically the steps that are outlined here. So for purposes of this demo, I'm picking up a pretty small and very simple plugin that I found called Workspace Rotation Plugin. I'm going to mute the viewers, please. So Workspace Rotation Plugin is pretty old. So if you look at its POM file, you can see that it's actually still compatible with Hudson 1.319. So we'll fix that among other things. And all it does essentially, let's see, it doesn't have a general description of the plugin here, but you can see what it does is it adds a publisher or a post-build action to a freestyle project that's called Workspace Rotation. And this is supposed to run after your build is complete, and it takes your workspace and renames it to a sort of a backup file named according to the build number. And then it also adds this action to the build. So this action is basically a badge that appears on the build. So it renders this little badge with a folder icon, a tooltip that says saved workspace. And it also adds a link to each build called Workspace, which basically offers a workspace browser for that particular build. So rather than there being a workspace saved for different builds of the project, this saves every workspace for every build. It's a very simplistic plugin. It doesn't try to do any kind of cleanup or anything like that. But it's small enough that it serves as a good sample for the kinds of changes we need to make. So the first thing that you need to pay attention to is the superclass. So this extends notifier. Notifier is a kind of a publisher. So in other words, a post-build action. And along with builders, these are called build steps. So these are things that sort of perform one action at a particular spot in a build. If you go back to the general compatibility guide, it talks about build steps, and it says if you want to allow these to be used from workflow, then what you need to do is implement this interface simple build step. And this is only available in newer versions of Jenkins. So the first long-term support release that allows this is 1.580.1. So we're going to update this plugin to depend on 1.580.1, and I'm going to make a few changes and cleanups along the way. Some of these things are not actually specific to adding workflow support. They're just things that you should do anyway as part of updating to new Jenkins APIs. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with the pristine old version of the plugin sources. And this should have applied some local changes here. Yep. So here I've sort of prepared the changes that we want to make for workflow compatibility, and I'll go through particular things I've changed one by one. So the first thing we did is we just updated the Jenkins core requirements so that now we're using 1.580.x APIs. So you can see that depending on your IDE, you should see that your dependencies have been updated to use a newer version of Jenkins core. So this will be used to build against, it will be used to test against, everything. So let's go to the rotate class or publisher. So there you go. So first of all, I've added this implement simple build step. So I'm saying that I want this particular publisher to be considered a simple build step. That means that it doesn't make as many requirements about, or it doesn't make as many assumptions about how it's being run as publishers sometimes do in freestyle projects. So you can see some description, the simple build step Java doc. Here, this is a better way of seeing the Java doc here. So in a freestyle project, there's a very fixed order of execution that everything contributed by a plugin has to go through. First, certain build wrappers do their setup according to a flag set in the plugin, and then an SCM is checked out, and then other build wrappers do their setup according to flags set in the plugin, and then it does all of the build steps, and then it undoes some build wrappers, and then it runs certain publishers, and then it runs certain other publishers, and so on in a very fixed order. In a workflow, none of that's true. So any of these things, checking out from a CM, using build wrappers, using build steps, publishing results, any of these things can happen at any time. It just depends on what the script author requested. So there are certain things that are defined in the Jenkins APIs that only make sense for freestyle projects. So in this case, needs to run after finalized is something that controls the order of execution of a publisher in a freestyle project. That's going to be ignored when it's used from workflow. We can leave it in here so that this will still behave the same way in a freestyle project. But it's not going to matter to us. Simple build step Java doc gives some other notes about changes that you might need to make. It just depends on what exactly your build step was doing. I've made a couple of these changes here. Get required monitor service is not really a good idea to do anything other than none, even for a freestyle project. So I've set that to none rather than its original value. This is friendlier for concurrent builds. Some background stuff they've done is I fixed up the form binding. So in the original version of this plugin, it had some you can see in a diff view, it had this old override of descriptor new instance and some things like that that are not actually necessary in new versions of Jenkins. These are sort of old style APIs. In current Jenkins, you just say data-bound constructor for a public constructor on your class that defines any mandatory parameters you have to add. So we've added that in. We've also added a configuration page, the config.jelly. So this is something that allows you to define the any kinds of input fields where you want the user to be able to customize things. In the case of a workflow step, this config page, this UI configuration is actually used in the snippet generator. So if the user wants to know how to call your step from Groovy and they want an example of it, there will be a block at the end of the workflow configuration page where they can select your step and this page will be shown. So in this case, we don't have any parameters, so we're not going to add anything here. Most existing publishers would actually already have a config.jelly and a data-bound constructor, so you would just leave those alone for the most part. So the main thing that we're going to do is that we're using a different overload of perform. So this is probably the thing most people will see, that the original signature was using an overload of the perform method, or an implementation of the perform method that took an abstract build So this is a Jenkins model object class that represents a build of a freestyle or freestyle-like project. So it could be a freestyle project, could be a matrix project, could be a Maven project, a few other less common ones. And freestyle projects, as I said, they make a number of assumptions about what things are executed in what order. And one of the things that's baked into the definition of a freestyle project is that every build gets exactly one workspace. So it runs on one slave, it gets one workspace. That's where your SCM gets checked out. And that's where all of your build steps run. So for a freestyle project, we could just call this getter, get workspace. That gives you the one workspace for this build. That doesn't work for workflows because a workflow could allocate 20 slaves in parallel and run different builds on each of them. So every time your step is run, it has to be told what workspace it's running in. So this new overload of perform that you get from simple build step, first of all, it gives you a more generic run. So this is a build that could also be a workflow build in addition to a freestyle build. And it tells you where the workspace is. It also changed task listener to build listener. That's not terribly interesting for most purposes, but it's a change in the signature. It also doesn't return a Boolean anymore. That was a deprecated feature of the original signature. The new signature just returns void. If it returns normally, the build step was a success. If it throws an exception, usually an abort exception or something, that means that there was a problem, and that's that. So other than that, we haven't really made much changes. We did a couple of changes to this workspace browser here. The main change that we made was that originally it specified an abstract build as the owner of the project. That doesn't make sense here because the build that this badge is attached to could be a workflow build, which wouldn't be an abstract build, but it would be a run. So we've generalized the type of that, and we've made some edits to some other methods to reflect that. So we've just changed a few method signatures to make them a little bit more general. If you're working on a plugin that has other plugins depending on it, then you might have to do more work here because you might have to keep the original method signature for backward compatibility. In this case, I'm pretty sure that nothing else is depending on this plugin, so it doesn't matter. Other changes I've made here are just sort of recommended parts of upgrading the Jenkins core requirement. I'm using run action 2 to deal with some issues that occur in newer versions of Jenkins. And I'm using I'm using the place where this workspace permission is actually defined. But other than that, this class is mostly untouched. So that's about it for the changes I had to make here. If there's anything else particularly interesting in here. So it's a mixture of general Jenkins upgrade changes plus a couple of workspace-specific things. And Chris K is saying something to me. Yes, it is supposed to be live. So I'm going to do a build of this. And one thing that I also want to do as part of adding workflow compatibility is I also want to add a functional test that proves that it's now compatible with workflow. This is optional, of course, but it's a good idea. And it turns out it's not all that hard to do. So in order to do this, all we had to do is we want to make sure that the workflow plugins are available for our functional tests. So I added a dependency with scope test, so this has no impact on the plugin that we actually build. It doesn't add a plugin dependency that users see. I added a test on workflow aggregator plugin. This is kind of a meta plugin that in turn depends on all of the other plugins in the workflow system. So I'm just saying, yes, please load all of these, make them all available. And the version I picked was not the most recent version of workflow, but it was the most recent version that's still compatible with the 1.580 line of Jenkins that I'm using as my plugin parent. So I'm setting it to 142. And then I create a functional test. So this turns out there were no tests in this plugin before now, so I'm creating the first one. So what I want to do here is I do some boilerplate to set up a Jenkins plugin functional test. So Jenkins rule is just what you use to make sure that Jenkins is started up for the duration of every test case, a fresh, clean instance that you can use to do things with. I'm going to create a new workflow project, and I'm going to set a script for it. So CPS flow definition is the basic Groovy CPS DSL option when you're configuring a workflow. So I'm just typing in inline Groovy script. So what the script is going to do, first of all, it's going to grab a workspace from the Jenkins master in this case, but it could be from a slave in general. Anything that is based on simple build step has to run inside the context of a workspace, because all traditional Jenkins builders and publishers assume they're running inside a workspace, and this file path and launcher are specific to the slave that it's running on. So I'm going to start up, grab an executor on a slave and get its workspace. That's what the node block does. And then I just want to make sure there's something in this workspace. So I'm going to create a file. This write file step is just built into workflow. Just a basic part of the workflow plugins. So I just write some plain text to a file in the workspace. And then when that's done, I'm going to use this meta step called step. This is also part of workflow, and it is a workflow step that just runs any simple build step that it's given. So core step takes care of all of the workflow specific plumbing and lets you just focus on the basic implementation in simple build step. So I'm going to run step, and I'm going to have it be configured with my publisher, whose class name is rotate. We'll see later how the user would find the particular syntax to use in this case. So I'll set that as the workflow definition. I'll run a build. So this schedules the build and gives me a handle on the build's progress, and then this just makes sure that the build completed and succeeded, which I expect it to. I'm going to go back and say, did this badge action actually get added to the run? So I'm asserting that this line got called, basically, that added this badge to the run. We say that's not null, it really got added. That has the right backlink to the build. And then this is available, was already part of the plugin. It just said that the workspace, that the backup workspace that this plugin created is really there. So I'm going to assert that it's there. I'm going to check that it has the directory name that I expect. So again, this is from this line in the publisher where it takes the original workspace, which is normally named after the job, and it appends a hyphen and then the build number. So asserting that that's there. And then I'm using HTML unit to say that if I go to the builds page, that's this URL of the build, and I tack on the URL piece for this action, WS. This is what's going to be a hyperlink in the sidebar. And then I try to browse to that file that I created. I'm going to get a plain text response back, and that's going to be serving up the text I actually wrote to the workspace. So we'll run this test. Should just take a moment to run. So here the test is starting up Jenkins 1580.1 in a temporary location. And it's initializing it. You can ignore the stack traces are all optional things that didn't get loaded that we don't care about. And then it says, yes, my project ran, so this is printed by workflow itself, and the test passed indeed. That's good. So let's run this project. So I'm going to use the HPI run goal of Maven to start up a test Jenkins instance using this plugin against the configured version of Jenkins. The nice thing is that HPI run also pays attention to any plugins that are in compile or scope or test scope, and it loads those up too. So all of these plugins that I can use from my functional test, anything I can use from my functional test, I can use in interactive test too. So if we should start up in a moment. There we are, and I've already gone ahead and created a test workflow for this. So in this case, it's a workflow that's just going to allocate a slave, and then I'm running a shell step where I'm taking the build tag. So that is build tag is basically a text string that's different for every build. That depends on the build number. Saving it to some text file. And then where did I get this from? So this comes from snippet generator. If I select general build step, so that's any kind of simple build step, workspace rotation, you can see that here, since our config.groovy view is empty, there's nothing else shown here, but normally there would be some additional fields that are coming down here that you could configure. If I say generate groovy, then it tells me what text I would need to put into my script in order to use this plugin. So I'll just do that at the end here. And if I run a build here, then we can go and look at the console output. And it said there's running my publisher. So that was this one. And this build, well, let's see, if you look in the build history, you'll see that this badge was added, saved workspace. So that was correctly added to the build history. And if you go to the build page, then you see a workspace link. So that's the action that's added by the plugin, this /WS here. And this gives you the usual workspace browser here. So if you look at the stuff.txt here, you'll see Jenkins test 3. So this is the file that was saved by build number 3. as opposed to the saved workspace for build number 2, which has some different content. So we see that it's working correctly, and it's doing the same thing as it would for a freestyle project. If you create a freestyle project, you shouldn't see any difference. So this is just going to, this is still going to show up in the post-build action workspace rotation, and it's going to behave the same way as it did before. So that's about all there is for this particular plugin. This is, as I said, this is a pretty simple plugin, so there wasn't too much to change here. Really, the only interesting thing we changed was this perform method override. And everything else kind of followed from that. If you're interested, this is saved as a pull request on this Rotate WS plugin, so that you can get a full overview of all of the changes I made in support of this. So that's about it for a description in general of how you update a plugin for workflow compatibility using something like simple build step. Of course, builders and publishers are only one of the things that plugins can contribute to freestyle projects. There are some other things that a lot of plugins use. So some plugins add SCM integrations. So if you do have an SCM in your plugin, then there's a list of changes that you should make based on API's newer Jenkins versions. Basically, if you compile with deprecations enabled, you'll see a bunch of these. And in the case of build wrappers, so these are things that would appear. Is it still running? That's not still running, but I don't think there are any build wrappers enabled in this. Yeah, there are no build wrappers plugins enabled in this Jenkins installation, but somewhere in the configuration screen for a freestyle project, you would see a list of checkboxes for build wrappers. I think it's called build environment or something like that. And various plugins can add to that. So if you have a build wrapper, there's a corresponding simple build wrapper. You have to bump up to a newer version of Jenkins, 1609 line. And simple build wrapper, again, lets you take the same class and make it work either in a freestyle project or in a workflow. And the difference from a build step is that a build wrapper takes a block. So it's wrapping a block of other code, doing some setup and some teardown. Other common things are triggers, and there's a set of things that you can do to update build triggers. That's the things that would appear in here if you had some plugins that contributed other options here. And in that case, it's mostly just replacing abstract project with job. Sometimes you have to do some other related changes for it. So that's the idea for updating an existing plugin class. The other major thing that you can do is you can define a new step. So I've kind of listed a guide here. Basically what you need to do is, if you have a dependency on this workflow step API in your plugin, then you can register new steps that appear that are available for any kind of workflow when your plugin is installed. And workflow step API is designed to be a very lightweight plugin, so it doesn't really add anything on its own. So you can just have this as a dependency of any plugin you like, and it's not going to force people to install workflow or see an option for workflow in their UI if they're not already using workflow. If they are using workflow, then it offers this integration. So the main things that you can do with Workflow Step API are you can create, I classify steps into three kinds. A synchronous step is just something that runs pretty quickly, that just often returns some value or does some simple operation. So some examples of that would be the write file step that we saw earlier that wrote a file to the workspace. So we have the usual boilerplate for Jenkins form binding here. So various parameters, getters and setters, and a data-bound constructor. And this has a config.jelly where we just specify the various parameters the user can set and provide a simple configuration UI for them. And then all of the interesting stuff is just here in the execution class. So one instance of execution is created every time the step is run, and it keeps any state the step needs. And in this case, it's very simple. It just uses dependency injection kind of pattern to get access to the workspace that it needs to run into, as well as the configuration of the step that's associated with. And it just uses some basic Jenkins API calls to write some content to that file. And that's it. In this case, it has no return value, so it returns null. There's a matching read file step that's very similar, except it returns the text content of a file. So it's returning a string by reading it. So those are sort of the very basic synchronous steps. They just do something quick and then immediately return. The more advanced mode is that you can create, we call an asynchronous step. This is something that might run for a long time, and it might be able to survive Jenkins restarts. So you could have a very long-running build that keeps on going even when Jenkins is restarted in the middle of your step. And various other things can happen while the step is running. So in order to allow this asynchronous mode, Jenkins tells the step when to start, and then the step tells Jenkins when it's finished. So probably the easiest example to understand is a sleep step. So this is just a very simple step that sleeps for a few seconds or whatever, or a few hours or whatever you configure it as. So it has the usual configuration for a time and a time unit. This is the pretty standard Jenkins data binding here that you get for all kinds of plugins. And in this case, we implement the more general version of step execution. And what we do is we do some preparatory work. So in this case, we're setting up a timer. So we're just calling a Java timer to do something after a while. And we return false to say that, no, the step is not yet finished when the start method completes. So Jenkins called the start method, and the step said, okay, I've done whatever I needed to do to begin this step, but no, I'm not done yet. Later on, it'll come back, and after the timer has elapsed, then it will say, okay, now this amount of time has elapsed. I'm going to return successfully from the step. So you can say on success to return a return value, or on failure if there's an error. This is the callback style. On resume is called if Jenkins is restarted while it's still sleeping. So you could, your workflow script could have said, sleep for a day, and a few hours into it, the Jenkins administrator upgrades some plugins and restarts Jenkins. It just comes back up, on resume is called, and your setup timer is called again. and it will just go back and say, okay, I still know when I'm supposed to be done sleeping. It's still one day from when the step started. So I'm just going to recreate this timer that got killed because it was part of the old Java process. So that's how you make an asynchronous step. You also want to implement the stop method. This is in case the user clicks the red X button on a build and they want to stop it. Then we want to cancel our timer task and tell workflow that the step failed, that it was aborted. And then the third class of step is also asynchronous, but it can take a block. So there's a block is just a sequence of other code or steps enclosed in curly braces in Groovy. So a simple example would be, or fairly simple example would be retry step. This takes its block and it runs it a few times, and if it fails the first few times, it prints a message to the build log, but it tries the block again. And if it fails on the nth time, then it gives up and fails the step. So to implement this, when the step starts, we use some special APIs with the body invoker, and this does I have a body. Well, first of all, we use this flag to say that I'm expecting a body for this step. And then when we run it, we say, okay, you can go ahead and call my body now. And let me know when the body is finished. So this callback gets notified when the body is finished. So if the block that you're enclosing finished normally, then great. We just return that value from the whole retry step. If it failed, then we decrement a counter for how many times we've retried it. So if it's not the last time, then we just print some message to the build log. And this is something we get using task listener. And we start it again. And if it was the last time that we're going to try it and we give up, then we just make the whole retry step fail with the same error as its block failed. So there are a bunch of block steps that typically do some kind of setup and then invoke their body and then do some kind of teardown at the end. Sometimes they can run their body multiple times. It depends on what the step is for. All right, that is everything I have prepared. So I would like to take some questions. Unfortunately, the Q&A feature doesn't seem to be working. So if there is anything on IRC, I'm going to look around for anyone who's on IRC who has any questions about it. Or if anyone is on audio who would like to ask questions.
Yes. The examples that you had shown to us, for example, the initial first example that notify a publisher that implements build step. So this example, is it already available in GitHub, or you created for us now?
Yes, so that initial example I've filed here in the Rotate WS plugin as a pull request. So here I'll share the link. Let me see if I can use the showcase. Here, I'm not sure if this works, but let's try that. There we go. So that might be saved with this recording, I'm not sure. Otherwise, you can just go and search for the Jenkins Rotate Workspace plugin. And this pull request will give the changes they made.
And one more question. The perform method has the workspace for each and every slave, right? So
Correct.
how do we determine on the build result? Say for example, I have 10 slaves, and on all 10 slaves different task is going on.
Hmm.
So how do I determine if my build is successful or failure? I assume that we have to set the result via build dot set result of result dot success or result dot failure. So how do I set that? Based on how do I decide whether in which workspace it failed, in which workspace it passed? Is it my based on my results I have to wait for until I get results from each and every workspace, and then finally I should set?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question. I didn't talk too much about that here. See if I can find the right document that gives some background about it here. So in this document, this is part of the um, basic steps. This will be linked to from the workflow homepage. There's more detailed description of what you can do to deal with build status. So the interesting thing here is that from a freestyle project, if you're in a publisher, especially one, if you're in a publisher that says needs to run after finalized, then you are guaranteed that the build status has been set, because a freestyle project will only run this publisher at the end of the build after it's decided on a status. That's not true for workflow. So from a workflow build, if you call build get status, build get result here, you could get various results. You could get success, failure. You can also get null. And null is actually the most common result if the build is still ongoing. Um, so you have to think about what you want to do to handle that. Now, there is I thought it was documented here. Yeah, so there is a catch error step that exists specifically to interact with publishers that expect a result to already be set. So some publishers, if you make them a build step, they may be assuming that the result was set by the time they run. And if you want to interoperate with those, then you can use catch error. So the idea with catch error, you know, I'll adjust this workflow to use it. So I think I want it here. So catch error you can use to work sort of like a freestyle project. You wrap it around the main build steps of your build and put publishers after it. And what it does is that if anything inside this block throws an exception, it sets the build status to failed, but then continues. So if I save that and just have a successful build like this, and just build scheduled, okay, so basically the same behavior as before, just the build is still successful, nothing different happened. But if I do something here, so error is a built-in workflow step that just unconditionally fails. So if I do that and say build now, and go to the console output, move this out of the way. So it ran my error step, which caused the build result to be failure. But then it also ran this custom publisher that I had. So you should see that we still have a workspace link and we still have a build badge. And if we were to do something like, say, listener get logger, println build get results. So if you change your plugin to pay attention to the build result, we'll show how this works. Let's rerun the plugin with that enabled. Wait a moment for Jenkins to start up. There it goes. So first of all, I'll try commenting out catch error and the error and build that, and this should print null because it hasn't set a build status yet. If I'm not using the catch error step. Yeah, so this says null, so this is what might happen in general. But if you rely on the build status being set to something, then you can use the catch error step. Apply and build now. And then this one you'll see this time, because I'm using catch error. Move this out of the way. So the publisher sees that the result is failure. If I don't have an error and I do it, then catch error should set the result to success. Okay, it's supposed to be setting the result to success. In this case, it's still null. But you can treat null the same as success.
But there are many different stages of results, right? Aborted, disabled, or unstable, success and failure. So there are so many things available, and I assume that nothing is possible with respect to Java coding. We have to handle all these in Groovy. Is that right?
Well, if you used well, for example, if you used general build step, I guess we don't have the right version of the JUnit plugin, but if you were using the JUnit plugin and you were archiving test results before the publisher ran, and the test results included some test failures, then you would see unstable for the result here. So you would be able to know that the result would come out as unstable in that case, that we had recorded test results and there were known to be failures. So that would be the usual case that you might run into. Again, publishers that are designed for freestyle projects sometimes make assumptions about the particular place in execution that they're being run. And if they're going to be used with workflow, they have to be somewhat more flexible and handle other cases, because you can't predict exactly how a user is going to configure the build and when they're going to run the publisher.
Okay, I have one more question.
Sure.
If okay, builders and publishers, we should always implement simple build step to make it workflow compatible. How about the build wrappers? What is the method that we have to override, and is it the same? Does it have the same signature, or is there any other special things that we should do it?
It is a different signature. It's a similar concept. So a simple build wrapper, get that up. Yep. The simple build wrapper would be a special kind of build wrapper that's workflow compatible. And so it has some of the the same kind of general guidelines that you would have for a simple build step. Like you should use the workspace that's given to you rather than trying to get a single workspace from the build and so on. The main difference in signature is that we have this slightly different setup method, which again, it's given a more general kind of build, and it's given an explicit workspace. And then it's given this context object, which you can use for two purposes. So first of all, you can set environment variables on it. So this is very similar to what you would do for a freestyle only build wrapper. It's just a somewhat different method signature, but it's the same idea. You would take the context that you're given here and call env to set environment variables within the build wrapper. And then for the cleanup, if you want to do some cleanup at the end of the block, then you just call set disposer, and you implement this pretty simple interface disposer. So this is a serializable callback that gets called at the end of your block. So in practice, the main work that you would need to do to upgrade a build wrapper to be workflow compatible is not implementing simple build wrapper, it's making sure that the serializability actually holds. So this is because if the workflow is running and it starts running your build wrapper and then Jenkins gets restarted in the middle of your wrapper, once Jenkins comes back up in a new Java virtual machine, the only thing it's going to have left to know what you need to do to clean up at the end of your block is whatever state you saved in this disposer. So it can keep, some disposer implementations don't need to have any extra fields. They're given the workspace that they're running in and so on. So sometimes they just are deleting some file that was created and set up or something like this. Sometimes they need to keep track of some additional information, like a temporary file that they need to delete or something like that. So you'd keep all that state in your disposer. And so again, this is sort of a simplified way of writing one of these wrapper steps. So rather than using Workflow API directly and paying attention to different workflow packages and API calls, there's less to learn if you can just implement simple build wrapper. It also lets you do a couple of other kinds of customization, so you can change the launcher if you want to do things like adjust commands that are run within the block. And you can also create a logger decorator so you can post-process a build output that's printed from within the block. So those are just a few of the most common things that build wrappers do. You can also do in this mode. And again, there's a workflow step. It's called core wrapper step. This is a block scoped workflow step called wrap. And it just takes any configured simple build wrapper, and just as with core step, it does all of the workflow specific boilerplate dealing with workflow specific APIs, so that for a simple build wrapper you don't have to pay attention to all of that. But the concept is pretty similar.
Okay, and the setup and teardown methods, I might have to take care and make sure that it's all implement serializable. And how about the pre-checkout method? Should I worry about that? Because pre-checkout method is already available and is one of the overriding methods in a build wrapper. So should I worry about that, or
So again, this is one of the things that's hard coded into the life cycle of a freestyle build, is that build wrappers who override run pre-checkout to be true. Or is this? Sorry, those that those that override pre-checkout get called before an SCM is checked out, and those that override setup don't. You can continue to use that flag in a simple build wrapper. You can say whether you want your setup to be done before or after the SCM checkout if it's run from a freestyle build. So by overriding this, you can keep the same behavior for freestyle builds. But from a workflow build, you're not in control of when it runs. That's up to the user. They can decide that they want your wrapper to be used in the middle of some step that they're doing, or they can wrap it around everything else that they're doing. That's not your decision at that point. So, for example, this GitHub, we can get some syntax coloring. So here's an example of the build wrapper from the XVNC plugin that's being used just for a few lines in the middle of a build. So just for a very temporary portion of this otherwise pretty complicated build, we're using the XVNC wrapper. In this case, we didn't care about using XVNC virtual display during our Git checkout because it just doesn't matter for that purpose. So, but if it's a build wrapper that somehow affects the environment in a way that would change how an SCM checkout behaves, then it's just up to the user to put this wrap block around their checkout from Git or Subversion or whatever it is.
Okay. Thank you so much.
For the good questions. I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions coming in from IRC. It doesn't look like we do. So, oh wait, I have something in. Okay, so there is a chat window that was working. So if there's anybody who's watching who's able to type anything into the chat window and you have questions, please go ahead. But otherwise, I think that's it. And you can, if you have any other questions, you can ask on the Jenkins developer list, or try to contact me in IRC, or there's a Jenkins workflow tag on Stack Overflow that you can use to ask questions as well.
Yeah, sure. I hope this video is available for the recorded video is available for future reference.
Yes, this is Hangout on Air, which means that there should be a YouTube page, which should also be linked to from the Jenkins Office Hours page for this. So everything during the live portion should have been put on YouTube and recorded. Right, thank you for everyone who attended, and again, you can ask any other questions later in various venues. Thank you.